In the year 922 AD, a Muslim diplomat named Ahmad ibn Fadlan was traveling through Russia when he witnessed something that haunted him for the rest of his life. He saw Viking raiders perform intimate rituals with a slave girl before burning her alive alongside their dead chieftain. His account reads like a disturbing horror movie, except every word was true. What you're about to hear comes from real historical sources that reveal how Vikings used sexuality as a weapon of war, a method of controlling society, and even as part of their journey to the afterlife. These practices influenced medieval Europe and shaped ideas of power that in some ways still exist today. The evidence is so disturbing that many historians once dismissed it as propaganda from the Vikings' enemies. But it's supported by the sagas, archaeological findings, and eyewitness reports. This includes everything from public wedding consummations in front of entire families to sexual executions performed as entertainment, to rape used as psychological warfare, and even funeral rites involving human sacrifice. For the Vikings, violence and pleasure were often two sides of the same coin. In Viking society, your sexual role could determine whether you lived as a respected member of the community or were treated as a social outcast. Power and dominance ruled all intimate relationships with the subtlety of a battle axe. Two key insults, Arger and Rhaegar, referred to men who were sexually passive or feminine. Being called one of these was such a devastating insult that Viking law actually allowed you to kill the person who said it without facing legal punishment. This created a rigid sexual hierarchy. The active partner, the one who penetrated, kept his masculine honor and social respect. The passive partner lost his manhood entirely, along with his legal rights, property, and community standing. In other words, your sexual position could decide your position in society. The laws were extreme by modern standards. Men accused of being sexually passive could lose the right to testify in court, inherit property, or even carry weapons. Essentially, being seen as weak in bed could strip you of your citizenship. The Icelandic sagas include cases where men lost everything because someone spread rumors about their sexual performance. Many blood feuds recorded in these sagas began over sexual insults. One saga, the Saga of Burnt Noal, tells of a conflict that killed dozens of people because one man called another unmanly. Egil's saga describes warriors traveling hundreds of miles to murder someone who had questioned their masculinity. Even a hint of sexual submission could start a killing spree. Women could use these insults as weapons. The sagas describe wives who destroyed their husbands' reputations by publicly questioning their masculinity in bed. In the Laxdæla saga, one woman divorced her husband and ruined his social standing by claiming he was too gentle in bed. This obsession with dominance created a vicious cycle of violence. Men constantly had to prove their masculinity through aggression, which led to more conflict, which in turn required more shows of dominance. Sexual violence became a tool of social control. The threat of being labeled sexually passive kept men in line and reinforced the Viking power structure. Vikings even turned sexual humiliation into a calculated psychological weapon. They knew breaking a man's spirit was more effective than simply killing him. The sagas mention something called shamestroke, cutting or stabbing a defeated enemy's buttocks to symbolically suggest sexual penetration. This act wasn't random. It was carefully designed to humiliate the victim by marking him as sexually conquered. From a Viking perspective, this method had an advantage. You could destroy someone's masculinity without actually having to perform the act. But often, they went far beyond symbolism. Defeated enemies, especially leaders, were sometimes subjected to public sexual assault to demonstrate their complete defeat. The saga of the Valsangs tells how captured kings were raped in public to strip away their masculinity and transfer it to their captors. Vikings believed that forcing someone into the passive role literally took their masculine essence and added it to the victor's own. The humiliation was so deep that many victims could not return home without facing rejection from their own people. Some took their own lives, rather than live with the shame, while others became wandering outcasts, walking reminders of Viking power. Vikings practiced sexual enslavement on a massive scale. In markets like Dublin and York, slaves were sold for many purposes, including sexual use. Raiders divided captives like livestock, with the most attractive kept for leaders' private use. The Orkneyinga saga mentions Earl Sigurd keeping a harem of captured Irish women, treating them as interchangeable possessions. Viking law created a two-tier system. Free women had significant protection against sexual assault, but captives had no rights at all. Any free man could use a slave sexually, and killing a slave for resisting was barely a crime. In medieval Iceland, raping a free woman could carry the death penalty, while raping a slave woman was punished with only a small fine, about the same as damaging someone's property. The scale of slavery was staggering. Archaeological evidence from Dublin suggests that up to 30% of the population were slaves, many captured specifically for sexual purposes. This system of dehumanization also served a strategic purpose. Word of Viking sexual violence often caused entire communities to surrender without a fight, rather than risk such treatment. Even Viking weddings were shockingly public. Privacy wasn't just rare, it could even cause legal problems. The bride's family was expected to witness the couple's first sexual encounter to confirm the marriage had been consummated. Without proof, the marriage could be declared invalid, and the bride's family could demand the dowry back. The ceremony itself was full of sexual symbolism. One ritual, called Melnir, involved placing Thor's hammer on the bride's lap as a blessing for fertility, a symbol everyone understood to have sexual meaning. The hammer would then be blessed by a priest and passed around for guests to touch. Another tradition involved the groom removing the bride's crown in public, clear announcement that he was about to take her virginity. Witnesses would then escort the couple to the marriage bed, where priests and family members offered fertility blessings. Family members waited outside the door to listen for sounds that confirmed the marriage was complete. The next morning, the blood-stained sheets were examined and displayed as proof of the bride's virginity. These sheets could even be kept as legal evidence in case the marriage was disputed later. In some cases, a family member stayed in the room during consummation to act as a witness. The saga of Grettir the Strong tells of a bride's uncle doing exactly that. If the bride was not a virgin, her family could be sued for fraud. If the groom couldn't perform, the bride's family could demand payment for damaged goods. Icelandic law spelled out exact penalties for various sexual failures on the wedding night, turning intimacy into a legal contract. Love had little to do with marriage. It was about property, alliances, and bloodlines. Ahmad ibn Fadlan's most shocking description was of Viking funeral rituals. When a chieftain died, the funeral became a multi-day sexual orgy intended to transfer life force to the dead, so he would have power in the afterlife. The Vikings believed sexual energy could be passed through the living to the dead. They would ask the dead leader's slave girls, which one of you will die with him? One would volunteer, believing she would join him in Valhalla as his eternal companion. For several days before the funeral, she would drink, take drugs, and have sex with multiple men from the tribe. They told her to tell your master that they did this out of love for him, believing they were transferring spiritual energy. On the day of the funeral, the girl was taken to the funeral ship for final encounters with 6 men, each representing a different form of tribal power. Then she was laid beside her master, strangled with a cord, and stabbed by an old woman known as the Angel of Death. The ship was set on fire, sending the chieftain and the girl into the afterlife. To the Vikings, this was considered the highest honor. The girl became a goddess-like figure carrying the tribe's collective energy to the land of the dead. But from a modern view, it's one of history's most systematic examples of sexual violence disguised as religion. Viking society was full of contradictions. Free women had rights that wouldn't appear in other parts of Europe for centuries. They could divorce husbands for poor sexual performance, inherit land, run businesses, and even propose marriage. Some women commanded ships or managed trade routes. But these rights only applied to free women. Enslaved women had none and could be used by any free man. This contrast was intentional. It made freedom more valuable by showing how degrading slavery could be. Viking women sometimes encouraged men to commit acts of sexual violence against enemies to maintain their own freedom and status. Still, not all female lives were valued. Unwanted baby girls were sometimes left outside to die from cold or wild animals. The Vikings also had complex attitudes toward same-sex relationships. Homosexuality was acceptable as long as a man stayed in the dominant role. Being passive meant total loss of honor. Some warriors kept both wives and male lovers, treating sexual dominance like a collection of trophies. Even the gods in Viking mythology faced sexual challenges. But for the Vikings, whether with men or women, sex was never just about pleasure. It was about power, status, and control. In Viking politics and mythology, sexuality was never far from power. The trickster god Loki was constantly mocked for taking on female form and even giving birth, most famously to Odin's slaped horse Sleipnir. Odin himself faced criticism for practicing seer, a form of magic strongly associated with women. The Prose Edda describes how other gods openly questioned Odin's masculinity because of these practices, which they considered feminine. The use of seer shows how deeply gender and sexuality were linked in Viking culture. Men who performed this type of magic were often labeled ergi, meaning sexually deviant, because they took on roles associated with women. But here was the paradox. Those same men were also feared and respected for their supernatural power. In other words, some of the most powerful men in Viking society were also the ones whose masculinity people questioned the most. Viking law reflected these contradictions with its trademark Nordic precision. While there were no direct bans on homosexuality, there were harsh penalties for accusing someone of being sexually passive. In fact, legal codes treated false accusations of sexual passivity more seriously than many violent crimes. The penalty could be equivalent to murder. This was because a man accused of being sexually submissive risked complete social ruin. Whether it was in dress, behavior, or sexual conduct, showing even a hint of femininity could strip a man of his rights, reputation, and future. The pressure to maintain masculine dominance was so intense that it influenced nearly every part of Viking life, from clothing styles to career choices, to even religious practices. The Vikings also turned sexual violence into public entertainment, approaching it with the same enthusiasm modern reality TV producers bring to shocking stunts. Justice wasn't only about punishment, it was also about spectacle. Court sentences often doubled as sadistic theater, designed to humiliate as well as penalize. Criminals convicted of sexual offenses faced punishments that mirrored the humiliation they had inflicted. A rapist, for example, might be publicly sexually assaulted as part of his execution, while the crowd cheered. Adulterers could be castrated before a live audience, which treated the event almost like a sporting match. These punishments served several purposes at once. They reinforced social hierarchies, humiliated the offender, and provided mass entertainment. Public executions sent clear messages about who held power while also feeding the Vikings' appetite for creative cruelty. Some sagas describe full festivals where sexual violence was scheduled entertainment. Captured enemies might be forced to perform degrading acts for the amusement of the crowd, with spectators betting on how long the victims could survive certain forms of sexual torture. The saga of the Jomsvikings even describes tournaments where prisoners were subjected to increasingly elaborate and degrading sexual humiliations until they either died or went insane. Archaeology backs up these accounts. At execution sites, researchers have found evidence of ritualized violence far beyond simple killing. Many bodies show signs of mutilation that point directly to sexual humiliation being part of the punishment process. By making sexual violence a normalized form of entertainment, the Vikings created a cultural script that explained and even celebrated the atrocities they committed during raids. Rape and torture weren't random acts. They were seen as acts of dominance worthy of praise, almost a kind of performance art. The Viking worldview wove sex, power, and violence together with the precision of a master-forged weapon. These practices were not chaotic bursts of barbarism, but calculated methods of social control. Sexuality was used systematically to enforce power hierarchies with brutal efficiency. It's important to understand, these were deliberate strategies, not spontaneous cruelty. They shaped medieval Europe's political and cultural landscape, and their effects can still be felt today. Through their conquests, trade, and settlements, the Vikings spread their ideas about masculinity, dominance, and sexuality across continents. That legacy lives on in many ways, in genetic lineages, in laws, and in the concepts of male honor and dominance that persist in some parts of the modern world. Their influence wasn't limited to Scandinavia. From the British Isles to Eastern Europe and even parts of North America, Viking culture carried its complex and often brutal ideas about sex and power to every corner of their expanding world. So, what other historical sexual practices might shock modern audiences just as much as the Vikings? History is full of civilizations whose views on intimacy, dominance, and humiliation challenge our modern understanding. Which one should we explore next?